So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. I suppose just to begin, I have about 3/4 of an hour to try and get people to understand what we mean when we say compassion. But just to say, as Patricia highlighted, I was very fortunate to win a Fulbright scholarship to the Dana-Farber Cancer Centre a couple of years ago. And while I was there, I undertook a study looking at how does a palliative care team provide compassionate care in a large cancer cure-orientated hospital, and how do they manage to do that. And so some of what I'm talking about today comes from that data. But one of the questions that is often asked, and originally I thought about this as, can you teach compassion? Is it something you can teach? Is it something innate? But I think the bigger question is, can we learn compassion, and what do we learn when we start to consider and look at this topic? So I hope over the next 40 minutes I'll try to interest you in the area of compassion. So I suppose there are 4 questions I hope to address in the next couple of next 45 minutes. What do we mean by compassion? What does that actually mean? And within that, what I want to try to get across to you is that compassion is more than a feeling. It is about the response to a particular situation, and it's based on the action that we actually derive from that. So the action of compassion is a key message of what I'm trying to talk about today. I want to talk about why is it important, and particularly important in palliative and end-of-life care. I don't mean to suggest that compassion isn't important in a more global sense, but that's my field. And a lot of the work I've done is, well, what's its meaning in palliative and end-of-life care? Is there an essence of it? If you think about the care we give to patients at end of life, somewhere in there is an expectation that we deliver care compassionately. But what does that actually mean? How do I know if that care is compassionate? How is it experienced by the patient and family? I'm going to say, can we learn compassion? I've some information about that, which was very interesting. And then I think probably, which links very much to what Michael spoke about today, how do you actually cultivate a truly compassionate response from those who care? And in this case, I'm talking about the professional caregiver. So how do we actually develop the compassion itself as the practitioner giving care to our patients and families? So what do we mean by compassion? Well, at the end of the day, compassion frames itself through a construct of suffering. We see compassion because we see the suffering other. And the example I want to give you is, if you think of the journey, and often our patients talk about journeys, the journey our patient has which brings them to palliative care. Along that journey they will have experienced the highs and lows, where things have gone well, where things have not gone well, where they've had surgery or interventions that have been successful or not successful. And they go through this journey, and some people refer to it a little bit like falling off a wheel. At the end of it, they're either physically and mentally exhausted, or somehow the message that things have not gone well was not brokered well by whoever told them. And so when we first meet that person, we're sometimes seeing a sense of somebody who has reached a point of woundedness or brokenness. And part of what we do in that initial engagement is to try to see how we can manage and support that, how we can put the pieces of that brokenness together. That's part of a compassionate response. Many of you, and certainly the whole world, will remember this picture. Little boy from Syria on the beach in Greece. And I'm not showing you this because I want to shock you into compassion, but it's because it gives you the sense of what the action of compassion is about. Compassion as a response to suffering requires that we witness that suffering. We see the suffering, and that suffering makes us feel something. The theologian Henri Nouwen, who wrote a very nice book, which I'll talk about later, on compassion in a Christian context, he said very strongly that actually when you sense the compassion, you feel it in your gut. The word he used was the splanchismai, the Greek word for your gut. It's you feel a physical sense of, oh my God, when you feel compassion. It's a catalyst to the compassion itself. And what you're seeing here is the soldier witnessing the suffering. He witnesses that. But in the third picture at the bottom, you see him do something. He picks the child up, he cradles the child, and he moves the child to a place of safety. And those three images sum up the action of compassionate care. You witness the suffering, you realize that you are moved to action, and you do something about it. And all the philosophers and all the theologians who consider compassion in different ways, all of them see those three components as an essential part of the compassionate response. And to do that, there are three things. You must recognize the suffering. And if you're a palliative care practitioner, part of your role is to have the skill to recognize that suffering. You have to have the courage to ask about the suffering and what it means to them. And I'm sure Michael would have perhaps referred to some of that in his speech this morning. And most importantly, you have to have the strength to wait. You have to wait for the response that comes back. And that can come back in so many different ways. And you have to think, how am I going to reach out to that response? And what will the impact of that be on me? The language of compassion is confusing because it gets tied up in all sorts of other language. So if you read it from a theological perspective, you start to talk about things like mercy and pity. If you read it from a psychological perspective, you tend to come about the difference between compassion and empathy. And I'm giving this as one example. This is work by Mary Vachon, who's somebody who's written an awful lot about compassion and self-compassion in particular, which it makes the point that empathy and compassion are extrinsically different, and it's all based on the issue of the action. So in this definition from this book chapter, what she's saying is that empathy reflects a heightened focused awareness of the experience of another person as something to be understood. But it isn't necessarily suffering as such. You can be empathetic to people and it's not just around suffering. Compassion is much more focused towards that suffering other. It is an awareness of another person's experience, but it does not entail the intention to relieve. It's the sense that there's something here. The compassion comes in when you are entailed to do something, when you're compelled to action. So I'm just giving you that because if you read on this topic, it can get very confusing because people tend to use the words interchangeably, and in fact they are quite different. So that action of compassionate care, and I use the image of the broken vase to try and get that message across to you. If you break a precious vase and you want to repair it, it takes time and patience, and it will never be perfect. When you break a vase and you put it together, you will always have the cracks. There will always be the gaps. And often the cracks and the gaps are the catalyst to where you need to go with this person or their family in their suffering. So they're very useful things. They're not failures. But in many ways, as you put those pieces back together, you may be recreating something new and quite amazing for the person, because they may be moving from the position of being the sick cancer patient or the person with a chronic life-limiting illness to reminding themselves that they're somebody's husband or wife or grandmother or child. And you, as a practitioner of palliative care, slowly put the pieces together to create the vase, which is different. And the piece about not being perfect is important because, you know, I've often said, the number of people who have said to me that when I die, there will be Jesus, God, and me, because, you're such a wonderful human being because of all the work you do in caring for the dying, and you'll just be going straight to heaven and you're wonderful. If you start to live that lie, then you will have a problem. Okay? It's a wonderful thing to have affirmation, but you have to be very aware of the boundary of how you work. And in a way, that's why the practice of palliative care is a slow, constant caring, as opposed to an intervention and then we withdraw. There has to be a process because the process is important. So if I just move on, all the world religions have compassion as its basis. If you read the Bhagavad Gita, if you read the Buddhist scripts, if you read the Quran, if you look at the Christian texts, somewhere in there is the context of compassion. What interested me particularly when I was doing my study was that a lot that's written about compassion in palliative care is very focused on a Buddhist perspective. Now, there's good reason for that, and I use the example of the Dalai Lama because that particular focus around Mahayana Buddhism is very much around the compassion as that sort of essence of life, and that's very important. But what struck me, of course, is, well, what does that say about our place in palliative care? Because if you look at the work of Cicely Saunders and you read her early letters, it is very clear that Cicely Saunders was a very, very committed Christian. And that Christian focus shaped her vision and value of what palliative care should be. In her early letters, she often argued that actually palliative care should be delivered by a community of people who come together, work together and pray together. Something like the L'Arche community that cares for ID people, the work of Jean Vanier and Thérèse Vanier. So, now, that's not what we are, but I'm not making a case here that a Christian view of the world is any better than any other. But it's important you understand the roots of where we have come from to understand where we're going to, because that root is very important in how palliative care developed. And so I urge you to read those early letters. I often make my poor students read them because I get them to understand why we are where we are at this moment in time. If you work in palliative care, this will be ingrained on your heart. You recite it on an hourly basis, I'm quite sure. But it very much speaks to that compassionate piece. And the idea of the total pain concept in palliative care here is very important because we often think of compassion at the psychological and spiritual level, but it is equally important in the physical level. When you have to make a decision that a person is going to require a syringe pump, the way in which you deliver that information is essential, because for you it may be a clinical decision. For the patient it may be an indication of where they are in their disease, and you're coming at it from two different perspectives. So it's essential that these concepts of you matter because you are you, your unique personhood is valuable to me, and you matter to the last day of your life. We do everything we can to help you die peacefully and to live until you die, whenever that may be. And in a way that frames the compassionate response that we need, because it means my focus is on the entirety that is you as a human being, in all that you have, and that I'm here as another human being, not to judge you or to comment on, but to simply be with. That being with as opposed to doing for is a critical element of the compassion itself. Of course, compassion does have a link within a Christian concept, but also within a spiritual concept. And if any of you have the book in the middle are the letters of Cicely Saunders, if you feel so inclined to go that way. But I would urge you to read the little book on the right, Watch With Me. It's a very small book that Cicely Saunders wrote towards the end of her career. And it's, as I say, because of her Christian context, it's very much focused around the idea of the apostles in the Garden of Gethsemane waiting while Jesus went off to do his prayer in the garden. But there's something fundamental about the watching with me which is very important. Remember, in the picture of the soldier, it's about the witnessing. There is something very important about the witnessing of the suffering of the other person. And that sometimes you need to let that emerge before we try to act. As clinicians, we're all taught that we make it right. We have a plan. I mean, I teach my own students, when you're doing clinical assessment, it's important you've got a plan for today, and then if that doesn't work, what your next step will be, and if that doesn't work, what plan C will be. And that's extremely important for the security of the care of the patient. What's equally important is that you have the ability to watch and wait to see what happens, because we're often not so good at that, because we need it to be nice and we need to tick a box and we need to sign something so that we have something lovely for HICWA. Now, I'm not being critical of HICWA, but I'm making the point that it's more than that. The care that we give has got to be more than that, and the watching and the waiting is very important. Small little book, 20 pages, but it's a world of wisdom around why we need that compassionate piece. So I'm going to give you a definition. Now, I'm threading this through from my argument around Cecily Saunders from the Christian concept, and I want to be very clear, there are many, many, many definitions of compassion. But I'm using this one because this was written by Henri Nouwen, the philosopher, and I just want to flag this. This was written in a very interesting way. This little book was written in a coffee shop by these three guys who are, in fact, as they happen to be Roman Catholic priests, and it was written in the 1970s at a time when there was a lot of political turmoil in South America, and they'd all worked in South America, particularly in Chile. And they were writing this book in response to a doctor who was a friend of theirs, whose son had been captured by the junta and killed and had been found on a roadside. And they questioned the whole issue of compassion in society. And this definition comes from that book. And what they're saying here is compassion asks us to go where it hurts, to enter into places of pain, to share in brokenness, fear, confusion and anguish. It's the full immersion in the condition of being human. That's an awful lot I ask of you if you're a palliative care practitioner, that you will deal with that every day in many different ways. But there is something about what that full immersion means and the risk it has to you in terms of self-care. I use the analogy of you get into a pool and you can't swim, so you have your water wings, you've got a way to get out. When you choose, and in some way you have to be invited in by the patient and family to do this, if you choose to immerse yourself in this, how will I get out of this? How will I find my way out of the pool? And that's really important. So that's just one definition, and I just want to share that with you because it will help as we go along and look at this issue of learning. And just in case you hadn't quite got my message around the palliative care link here, I just want to share two archetypes. And again, focusing on the Cecily Saunders theme, I'm looking at the concept of this in a Christian way, but there are other ways. And here you have the archetype of the Christian symbol of compassion, the Good Samaritan. And I'm showing you two pictures here. If you take the one on my left, I don't think I've got a thing, maybe that works. Yes, this one. This is a painting by a guy called Bossano. And what you see is a very traditional image of the Good Samaritan. But see what he's doing. He's holding, he's supporting, he's providing a pallium, a cloak or a cover to somebody who is wounded and broken and in need of care. The other painting is by Van Gogh, and what's very interesting about this painting is that he painted this when he was himself incarcerated in a mental health asylum very shortly before he committed suicide. And I think it's interesting that of all the images he could have painted, he chose to paint an image which was an archetype of compassion, because at that moment in his life he himself was suffering. So those images remind us, and I think they're helpful because what they do is they remind us around some of the key things in compassion that we need to understand. They remind us about the cloak, the cover, the support, that sometimes we can't change the inevitability, but we can still be there, we can do something. And I'm showing you here too, these are from a book that was done by a lady called Anne Henrik called Healing Hands, and it's looking at the role of nurses and how they use their hands in practice. And the text of this was written by the late Maeve Binchy, because she was a friend of Anne's. And what you're seeing here are two hospice nurses, and the nurse at the top is helping a patient with myeloma find a place of comfort for himself. If you know myeloma as a disease, it's very painful. And at the bottom you're seeing one of the nurses apply eye makeup to a patient with MND because her husband's coming to see her and she wants to look good for him. All of those are the small acts of compassion that are essential. And to do that you need these things. You need commitment and confidence. People need to feel that your presence is one of confidence, and that's why I use that the presence of another person is a place of security, because actually we get too lost in I have to find the right word, when in fact the physical presence can often be enough to the compassionate support. We do it through good communication, but most importantly we do it through collaboration. This is not about a solo run. And in palliative care, it is how we as the team function to do this. And my compassionate self is not just about how I react with the patient, But how am I with my colleagues? Am I concerned about how my colleagues are? Do I have a worry about one of my colleagues in delivering this? And is that something I need to address? So all of those are part of this compassionate concept. So very briefly, why is that? Why do we think compassion is important, even as a concept? And one of the papers, you possibly can't see it very well here, but it's by a very well-known author, Joan Halifax, on the precious necessity of compassion. And she argues very well in this paper that really every aspect of our caregiving has to come from a place of compassion for it to be meaningful, both to us and to the patient. Because if we cannot find that sense of compassion, then we start to move ourselves towards the challenge of burnout or the challenge of compassion fatigue, neither of which I'm speaking about today. Compassion is about society. So what are the messages that we can learn about that? And I'm giving you one example, because compassion is not about a practical caregiving. It's about how does our society see ourselves as compassionate people? And this is, just to do that, you need to understand something of your own history. So I give you the two sides of the Irish psyche. You have, this is a picture of Loch Corrib, where I live. You can see that from the back of my house, and isn't it gorgeous, and it's beautiful, and it's lovely, and the moment I'm swamped with Americans passing through, and isn't it fantastic, and it's beautiful. Then the reality is there's another side to our history, which is of devastation and separation and pain. And we can't consider one without the other, because to understand something compassionately, you need to understand the dark and the light together. And I can remember as a young child being in Dublin at the time of the Dublin bombing. And I remembered the pain and suffering of people at that time and the fear that went with that. All of those things speak to Henri Nouwen's fear and anguish and brokenness. And so, but if you think what came out of that, with its good and its bad, you have the Good Friday Agreement. You have the sense that we can work together. And one of the lines in the Good Friday Agreement is that we will learn to live together compassionately. So compassion is not simply an act, it's a way of being. And therefore, I question that we need to think about compassion as our everyday living, not just the way we work in practice. However, there are also reasons why we do need to think about it in a clinical sense. And another level of learning is the challenges, particularly in the UK in recent times, around issues suggesting that particularly nurses, but not entirely nurses, had lost compassion, and questions like we should go back to the original way in which nurses were trained because academic nurses are not compassionate. And the two cases here are the Francis Report, or sometimes called the Mid-Staffordshire Report, and the Liverpool Care Pathway for the Dying Patient, both of which were found to have significant flaws. And despite all the rhetoric, with the best of intention, and they were, in many ways, they did the best they could, there were challenges that need to be addressed in them. And I flag up a paper here that came out of all of that, which is called One Chance to Get It Right. And Claire Henry, who's the Chief Executive of the National Council for Palliative Care in England, she voiced that, and she said, at the end of the day, we have one chance to get this right for people at end of life, and sadly, we miss that on so many occasions. And the compassionate piece is, what they argue is, if people had approached some of these decisions from a place of compassion rather than necessarily a place of clinical excellence, which is a very dangerous area to go sometimes, maybe the outcome would have been better. So I think it's an important thing to think about. Because if we don't, then we have compassion failure. This is an image a friend of mine did, it was published in the Irish Times, but you get that woundedness, the brokenness. You can see just about the black dog of depression around the neck of this poor woman. And we have to find some way to engage with that, to enter into that with them, to try and find a way to help them find a way through. So the ultimate piece, can we learn compassion? And is there evidence? Well, there's two papers here, and I'm going to talk about both of them, so I'm just showing you them. The one on the left is about a training program called Being with Dying. And this is a program that they do in the States. Joan Halifax is very involved in this. And it was an evaluation of, does this actually make a change to the way in which people act in a compassionate way? And the paper on the right was done in Harvard by Helen Weiss, and it's a paper on empathy training. So this is an example where empathy and compassion sometimes coalesce, if you like, in terms of what they actually mean. So I'm going to focus just for a moment on both of those, because I think they give us some interesting messages. So the first paper is known as the BWD, and it's a professional training program on contemplative end-of-life care. And what they argue is that a contemplative practice, as part of your palliative care practice, cultivates and enables clinicians to respond with compassion. So there's something about, if you like, the mindfulness, the meditative state, something around that that will help people to engage in a more fruitful and holistic way with the client and the patient. And it's an 8-day residential program, and they had 500 people roughly who did that, and they did an online survey, and they did some telephone interviews with some people just to gather some data. So what did they say was important? Well, what they learnt was about the power of presence. And this is about the being with rather than doing for. They learnt about the power of presence, and that the quality of the attention was much more important than the length of time that they spent with the person. It was about how they engaged. They also understood that there was a way to be present to suffering without becoming overwhelmed by it, so the training gave them that. And they also understood that the only way to approach this was to see that they had to recognise their own grief in order to be able to reach out to the grief of others, if you like, an I-thou type concept. And that then required the importance of self-care. And a lot of the development then was, well, how do I develop self-care for me? What's important? And I often use the analogy, if you come to me for a job interview, I really don't care how many qualifications you have and how many years and how desperate you've been to work in palliative care. What I want to know is, what do you do in the fullness of your life that makes you see that it's worth living? Because if you can find that, whether I was talking to my students this morning and they were saying baking, I love to bake, that's fine. That's important, because that makes you human, that makes you who you are. And that is the thing. You might be beating the flour in the bowl because you need some outlet because you've had a hard day in the office. They're the things that's important. How do I live my life? Because that's you at the end of the day. You have to live your life, and that your palliative care is not your life. If I look at the other paper, the physician empathy, this was very interesting because I met this lady when I was there, and this doctor, she's actually a psychiatrist. She's a psychiatrist. And what she said was, an empathetic physician leads to better patient outcomes, greater patient safety, and less malpractice suits, which I think perhaps may reflect a particular American model. I'm not quite sure. But they did an RCT, which of course everyone says is the gold standard. Everyone likes RCTs. And what they were testing is, does an innovative empathy training protocol grounded in neuroscience, so there was a lot of learning and teaching in this, improve the patient's ability to, or patient-rated physician empathy? So I'll explain that in a moment. And what they did was they randomly assigned 2 groups of fellows or doctors, I should say, qualified doctors, to standard postgraduate medical education. And one group of that actually had additional training around empathy. They got a 3-hour module on empathy. And then these are just the measures they used to do that. The bit that's important is the middle one. So what they actually did was, once they'd done the training, they got the doctors to run 2 outpatient clinics, and the patients came in, had their consultation, and then they were asked to rate the empathy of the clinician, but they were blinded. They didn't know if the physician had had the training or not. And what they found was that, obviously, as you would be pleased to know, there was a significant change in the care scores between those who'd had the empathy training and those who were in the control. So they demonstrated that actually if people have empathy training, it does actually make a difference in the way in which they approach the patient. And obviously the clinicians got much better understanding of the neurobiology of empathy and how that works. But what was also very interesting was they were able to say that the physicians were able to demonstrate a better understanding to decode non-verbal communication. So they were better able, if they gave an information to a patient, they were better able to see, did the patient actually understand, or did she not understand, or have I touched a nerve and I need to go back? With the other group, they didn't. So if you're asking me, is there something that you can learn? There are aspects you can learn in relation to compassion. Whether that then makes you a compassionate practitioner is a completely different question. But there are certainly elements along that pathway of compassion caregiving that you can learn in some way. So I suppose we do need to be aware that there was a strength in this study because it was randomised and the blinding in previous studies had been unclear. But I suppose we also need to be very, very conscious that training in empathy to physicians in residency, it clearly can reduce the decline in empathy. So I think that's an important message from those studies. Let me just flag then a little bit more on this topic around the teaching piece in terms of some of the work that I was doing when I was in the US. And I was interviewing people, doctors and nurses who had worked. In fact, I interviewed senior physicians, nurse practitioners, social workers, and I basically did an ethnographic study. So I basically spent 6 months wandering around after them in the hospital. And I'm sure they hated the sight of me by the end of it. But I was really trying to observe what they were doing. I wanted to see what they did as compassionate practitioners in that way. And these were the questions that I asked them. And these questions then went on to form a book that I show you on the previous slide that I wrote up. What does it mean to be a compassionate practitioner? How is it evident? And how do we foster that for the next generation? How do you foster compassion? And also, can we learn to be more compassionate? And if so, how? So I'm asking clinicians in practice this question. And I think what's important is they all said a resounding yes and a resounding no. And it raises a question about what does it mean to be a good clinician? Because some days that is all I can be. Some days I do not have the energy, the welfare, the rectitude or fortitude to be the compassionate practitioner, but I can still be a good doctor. I can still be a good social worker. I can still be a good nurse. I can still function and do what the patient needs. But for whatever reason, I have realised in myself I can't go that extra mile. And that's important. That you have the ability to say, I can and I can't. They all recognised that actually that compassion was an inner resource that sustained and nourished them. And one of the things I observed was almost a subliminal thing with one of the doctors. When she approached a room, rather than just walk into the room, she would always stop for a moment at the door. And then and if you didn't realise that she did that, you'd all walk into the back of her. But she just stopped at the door, and then she would go in, and she hadn't realised she did that. And so I asked her, well, what was going through her mind at that time? And she said, I'm not thinking about the clinician. I'm preparing myself for what may be invisible, what I might not see in that room. I'm trying to prepare myself to be present to whatever is there on the other side of the door. And she would literally stop. But it was really a fraction of a time that she would do it, but she hadn't realised that she did that, and she believed that was because she'd learnt that through mindfulness training and different programs that she'd followed herself. I think what was important was they all agreed that compassion should be a beacon which governs clinical decision making. And that's very interesting when we think about those bigger issues like right to life, right to die, do we use fluids at end of life or not? Those ethical dilemmas. If you come at it from a compassionate perspective, does that change the way in which you might address it? But also they felt that compassion offered a language particularly around changing goals of care, so that if they realised that they were going to say to someone, we're moving to the very end of your life here, if they came at it with a compassionate perspective, they would find a way to be able to do that in a meaningful and caring way. And the questions that then is, can you express it through in the classroom? Can you express compassionate practice in the classroom? And it's certainly difficult because it involves you as the individual. And the concern that they raised was, if compassion becomes a learnt behaviour, so I've taught you this and now you all know it and off you go, is it any longer compassion? Because there has to be an innate sense of the person in that. It's not a topic, it's not a module, it's not a programme. And then there was, should it frame curricula or should it be an essential component? And that was quite interesting, because actually if you look at most of our palliative care curricula, they touch on the topic of compassion, which we say is very important in palliative care, but it wouldn't necessarily be a module on it. There wouldn't be, it would come into other things. The question is, have we got the priorities right within that? And then finally, that what they felt the education can give you is compassion within and beyond the team, so that you start to learn about your inner resource as well as what you need in a team, in a group, to become a more compassionate practitioner. So what they argued was, can you learn compassion? Well, you can't teach it, but you can model it. And actually the modelling was the piece that was very important. You can teach the why of compassion, but you can't teach the how. But you can develop a palliative comportment, a way of being, and that perhaps you can teach self-compassion. There are skills you can learn within that. But the palliative comportment was important, because that's about the commitment and the confidence and all the things I showed you on the slide with the 2 nurses. That's important, because within that you can have your compassionate piece. And the risk, I think this is very from Gary Pasternak, when I think I'm too old for these late nights without sleep, a person in all their rawness, vulnerability and pain lays before me, and my heart cracks open again. And I think that's a very important message, that you're not being asked to be compassionate with an individual, you're being asked to be compassionate to a whole world of people with different needs, and your heart cracks open time and time again. And that's why you need to think then about that other piece, the self-care. And that's where I'm going to talk to the last few minutes of my talk. How do we cultivate a truly compassionate response from those who care? Well, I'm going back to Buddhism, because if anyone has got that right, the Buddhist construct has. In order to have compassion for others, we need to have compassion for ourselves. And if I do anything in my teaching with my students, it's to get them to understand that compassion begins with you. And that's about my baking, my walking, my hiking, my family. And the rest of it will come. The qualifications will come, the training will come, they're all important. But that other piece is vital if you wish to sustain yourself in this work. The other thing, I think, if compassion is a guide, you may be the only, if you work in palliative and end-of-life care, you may be the only group where the patient and family hears somebody use the word death. And we should never be afraid to use that word, because, as I say, you may be the only people that have ever said it. Now, we don't need to push it out, we don't need to force it out, and we don't need to spit it out. But we do need to make sure that we say it in as gentle a way as we can. Because part of our goal is the journeying across to enable people to come to a good end of life when that happens. And it's very important that somebody has the courage to say that. And that's why you need the witnessing and the action. But never be afraid to use that word death, because, as I say, you may be the only people that have the opportunity to use that with the client and patient. I want to share a poem with you, and this is particularly to those of you in the room who may be nurses. So this is written by a friend of mine, Ned Crosby, who lives in the west of Ireland, and he wrote a little book called Through the Glass Windows. And what he's describing here is, I live in Connemara, and I used to be the palliative care nurse there, and he's describing, actually I know the lady, the public health nurse, who is coming to care for a patient at end of life. And she's actually coming to do the laying out procedure for the preparation of the body after death. After the months in bed, those Sundays to Fridays, waiting for the morphine, after the days and weeks of the kept up face for her sisters and brother, after the last words to her daughter and son, nurse came to lay her out. At the loneliest moment, she sings a fragile lullaby, each note a petal of comfort. She was then the mother of the world, rocking her baby to sleep after the pain that was prayer. One of the most compassionate responses that we do is around the laying out of a person, because it exemplifies all the things that I've tried to explain today. It's the physical action of doing, it's the wrapping, it's the closing and bringing together of a life in some way, so that when they leave your care, they're going somewhere else as well. And if you've been involved in this procedure, we still talk to the patient when we move them as we prepare the body, because they are as present to us in death as they were in life. And those things are important, because it's often the greatest act of compassion that we do when we prepare someone, when we bring the family in when they've died for them to say their goodbyes, when we do that cleansing process of the body. All the rituals that we have around that speak to the compassion itself. And that's why I use that as an example, because I think it's important that the little actions that we do make the transformation of a compassionate practitioner. I'm not asking you to suddenly become omnipotent beings of grace that are suddenly going to, magically change the world, because it's actually that very small act that can make the whole difference of how the patient and family view you as a compassionate practitioner. I dread to put this up with Michael in the room, because Michael will know this because he ran this program, Who Am I, Who Cares? And it was a program that we used to run here, which was extremely important around this whole issue of self-care. I think the challenge in our society today is the question that sometimes I hear my colleagues saying, who cares who I am? Because in fact, that was probably the question that we tried to answer in that module. Is, they feel lost and abandoned, and they get lost in the system, and they get lost in the guidelines and the standards and all the things that are important in our healthcare service delivery. But at the end of the day, you have to answer that question for yourself. Who am I, who cares? Because only you can do that. My job as your colleague is to help you find a way to ask that question of yourself. Because I'm concerned about you, because I'm worried about you, I sense that something isn't right, and I have a responsibility to you as a compassionate colleague to say that I'm concerned, and that's all part of what that may mean. And the other point I want to make is, you may not see this very well, but this is there's a garden near my house called Bridget's Garden, and what you're seeing here, this is a very large sculpture in bronze. These are leaves that have been dipped in bronze. And what you're looking at is a sculpture which represents the ancient Irish goddess of spring, Eru. And what she's doing is she's listening to what's happening underneath. She's listening for the first shoots of spring, the first flowers to come up, so she can tell the world that winter is over and spring has come. And there's a traditional ceremony around that every year in Bridget's Garden. But it's very important because it's about that word that we used to call intuition. I told you at the beginning, Henry Nouwen talks about that gut. We can't lose sight of the intuitive self in our search for the scientific self, because the intuitive is important. And the phrase listening to the still small voice, you see it in, for example, in the Bible, it's in the Book of Kings, but it comes from the Talmud. And the phrase in Hebrew is called Mama Haga, and it means the voice of fragile silence. And what you do in you listen to your intuitive self is the silence is important. You can't actually start to listen to yourself unless you learn the capacity to be silent. And when you learn the capacity to be silent, it's amazing what can emerge. The voice of fragile silence, and it's in you. It's a little thing in you that will tell you, you need to act now. This is something you can't deal with. So I urge you in your compassionate seeking to listen to that still small voice, because it's within each of us, and it's really a guide that will help us. Some of you might know the story of the Velveteen Rabbit. The Velveteen Rabbit is in the box, and he says to the toys, how does it mean to be real? How will I know I've been loved? And the other toys say to him, when you're kicked in the corner and your stuffing's come out and your ears have dropped off and your eyes have been pulled out, you'll know then that you were loved, because a child cuddled you and held you and threw you round and wanted to be with you. And even though now you're stuck in the corner, someone loved you. And often it's a word that we seem a little bit afraid to talk about, the concept of love. It seems a little inappropriate. But there is something about the way in which love and compassion work together in terms of the way that and particularly for those of you who maybe work in older person care, you may be with patients for many, many years. And when they die, you feel and grieve that loss, and that comes from a place of love. So never be afraid to think of love as an important prerequisite of your caregiving, because it is important. And so a final thought. Some of you may remember when the President of Ireland met the Queen of England for the first time here. He made this phrase, we live in the shadow of each other. Compassion is not about me, it's about us. It's about us as a community. And what you do impacts on me, and how I live my life impacts on you. And I need to know you in your light and your shadow. That's very important, because we live in the shadow of each other. I cannot exist because of you. And that's important for our patients, because they depend on you for their very existence at this time. And you need to find ways to negotiate that. And finally, I go back to Henry Nouwen, because I think the important message, and this is also from that little book, you are the difference you make. You are the difference you make. What you do every day in a small way will make the difference and the transformative difference for somebody. And so compassion in many ways does come back to you as the individual, as the person. And the example I often give here is when I was a student, the nurses, I trained in London, and the nurses would appear with these enormous hats with things under the chins and big buckles and Petersham belts and all sorts of amazing paraphernalia. And the reality is, that was all about an image. That was all about the image of what a good nurse was. The reality is that when you want to do this, when you want to make the difference as you need to get rid of the belt and the buckle and the hat. And what they need is the individual I with you, I thou. They need to sense that you are here to be with me in my suffering and to do that in a compassionate way. Thank you very much indeed.